Hopefully, we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live session. I am Rakesh De from the team Voyages into the Past, and today we are extremely happy to have with us Professor Shantanu Chakrabarti, who is a professor of the Department of History and convener of Academic Committee of the Institute of Foreign Policy Studies of the University of Calcutta. Professor Chakraborty has done his BA from Presidency College in 1994 and MA from Calcutta University in 1996 and PhD from the same university in 2002. Previously, he had been lecturer in Lal Baba College from 1999 to 2000 and senior lecturer in Scottish Church College from 2000 to 2004. He has made research on privatization of security in the post-Cold War period and its implication for the Asian security, authored articles and web-based information capsules on global security, and participated in national and international workshops and conferences while being research fellow in IDSA New Delhi. He teaches on contemporary and concurrent history, international affairs, peace and conflict studies, and Indian foreign policy. He has been honorary president of AESI and also have the experience of teaching in various foreign universities like Uppsala University, University of Warsaw, etc., and hold various scholarly distinctions in India and outside India. He was co-investigator in the UGC UPE research project on India's Look East policy and its impact on eastern region of India, including West Bengal, from 2007 to 2012. Principal investigator in the UGC UPE research project on privatizing violence to restore order, evolving vigilantism and privatization of security in South Asia from 2012 to 14 and co-investigator in the King's College, London and IFPS, University of Calcutta, joint project on analyzing domestic drivers of Indian foreign policy from 2012 to 14. Besides of having editorial contribution, his books include Privatization of Security in the Post-Cold War Period and Overview of its Nature and Implications, Cooperation in South Asia, the Indian Perspective. Besides, he has contributed in various edited volumes, chapters in edited books, articles in journals, chapters reviews, and website publications, besides of participating in international and national conferences and workshops. Today, he will speak about international dimensions of India's international outlook and foreign policy making. Welcome, sir, to our live session from our entire team of Voyages into the Past. And thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Now I am going to hand over the microphone to you and you can continue your lecture. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again and over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Rakesh. Hello, everyone. Let me begin by first thanking the Voyages into the Past for kindly inviting me, allowing me to share some of my thoughts, which has been the subject of some of my recent research queries. Uh, in terms of foreign policy making usually is studied as a course within the course of history, modern history, uh, and it, as a student, I found out that most of my friends were, regarded as something like outside the province of history. That foreign policy, it was just a paper which is to be mugged up and reproduced during examination time. However, when I began to do my work and trying to look at the dimensions of foreign policy making, particularly in the context of Indian foreign policy making, I discovered that there was a rich historical uh, tradition which has influenced Indian foreign policy making, and more importantly, India's international outlook and global and regional interactions. And now, how do we really look at it? Uh, Usually, if you look at general textbooks focusing on Indian foreign policy making, uh, uh, as India became independent, usually, if you look at some of the older textbooks studied at colleges and universities, the general focus was to divide it, the focus that Indian foreign policy making essentially was Nehruvian in construction, the prime architect being Jawaharlal Nehru, uh, who played a historical role as a member of the core Congress committee, who was deeply involved in internationalism, a person who has had participated in Brussels conference, who had links with several other nationalist leaders fighting in different other parts of Asia and Africa, a part of global build-up. Uh, in fact, under his initiative, you had a foreign cell established within Indian National Congress, which had played a major role within the context of development of Asianism. Just to give you one example, the Congress Foreign Cell, for instance, when Sino-Japanese War broke out during 1930s, the Congress Cell was managed to send a medical mission under Dr. Kotnis to China. Dr. Kotnis later married a local Chinese woman and settled down there. Um, if you are interested in seeing old movies, there was an old Hindi classical movie made on the story called named Dr. Kotnis Ki Amar Kahani. But anyway, going back to the subject, the chief, whenever you talk about historical dimensions of Indian foreign policy making or India's international outlook, the story would always start with Nehru, how Nehru played an important role within the Congress in shaping up of Indian foreign policy, which later on would give rise to concept of non-alignment, uh, and after independence and all that. Uh, Now, Nehru, of course, played a very important role in shaping up Indian foreign policy, particularly because post independence, he still remains India's only prime minister who also was in charge of the Foreign Affairs Department till he died in early 1960s, 1964. Now, but there were multiple other historical levels of connection and other historical dimensions which have also shaped up and have influenced what has come to be understood as Indian foreign policy. Now, what are the chief characteristics? What should be chief characteristics of foreign policy? Right? First of all, is to determine territoriality, because what is foreign, which lies outside your own territory. Uh, Determining territorialism or territoriality is one of the first major factors in shaping up of your foreign policy. And two, ideology. Foreign policy making is not really diplomatic history. Of course, it involves diplomatic history in the sense of how you are dealing with different countries within your region or in the global world. But ideology has played a major role in shaping up of your foreign policy or in determining the choices which you make in adopting a particular course of action in within the international arena. It's not that it has been studied in the context of major international relations theories. I'm sure most of you are aware of some of the major themes like idealism, uh, realism, neorealism, and all that. Now, in fact, and significantly, it's one of the major historians like E.H. Carr who is often regarded as one of the founding members of the classical realist theory. When you look at his, his analysis of the 20 years gap between First World War and Second World War, what were the determining factors which were influencing European powers, etc. That is often regarded as a major study which focused on realism, that how nation states essentially are influenced by power relations, etc. However, uh, if you look at recent levels of research, ideology has once again made a major comeback in the sense, in fact, it had never gone that even when you talk about realism or power projection, uh, your course of action is often determined by a set of factors, historical dimension being and your historical legacy being one of the most important of such dynamic factors. Now, how does all this relate to uh, Indian foreign policy making and particularly its historical dimensions? Well, let me take two more or less recent texts which try to analyze historical dimensions of Indian foreign policy making. Uh, one text is Manjari Chatterjee Miller. She is a Canada based Indian scholar who wrote a book and this book came out in 2013 and it was titled Wronged by Empire Post Imperial Ideology and Foreign Policy in India and China. Now, why is this text important? Why am I saying this is important? Because Manjari Chatterjee Miller introduced a concept which she called PII, post imperial ideology, in the context of Indian and Chinese foreign policy making post independence. I mean, post Indian independence in 47. As we know, China never, China never became a formal colony. So, but she essentially is talking about post 1949 People's Republic of China. Now, what is this post imperial ideology, which she argues has influenced new entrants into the global sphere, like India and China, posts in the post Second World War period? Uh, Post imperial ideology, I quote her, comprises a sense of victimization that brings with it a dominant goal to be recognized and empathized with as a victim by others in the international system. This goal of victimhood, which is the dominant goal, uh, drives two subordinate goals. What are they? One, maximizing territorial sovereignty, and two, maximizing status. These three goals are inherent in post imperial ideology, and their pursuit shapes foreign policy in states that hold such beliefs. Uh, Now, this is Manjari Chatterjee Miller, who believes that foreign policy making of new entrants like India and China uh, after decolonization essentially is something which could be categorized as post imperial ideology. Let me refer to another uh, textbook which also deals a little bit with historical dimensions of Indian foreign policy making, which is by another Indian scholar, again settled abroad, named Iti Abraham. This book came out in 2014. Its title is How India Became Territorial: Foreign Policy, Diaspora, and Geopolitics. And here, Iti Abraham argues that independence of India simply did not mean territorial independence internally. It always had a global and regional focus and significance. I quote two of his lines: decolonization never meant only political freedom at home. It meant a claim to fully recognized and legitimate membership in the existing family of nations. Now, there are certain problems with these constructions. What are the problems? Uh, I find that both, these approaches essentially take a very simplified binary approach between colonial approach and the nationalist approach towards foreign policy making and international outlook. In reality, both were quite complex in nature, having multiple shades. Within the general tradition, colonial state, or the India as a colonial state, of course, was, I'm sure, most of you are aware of how the Indian colonial state was extremely important strategically for the British Empire. Why? Primarily because of its territorial location. Because if you look at the British Empire during its heydays, covering a large portion of Asia and Africa, India, uh, situated almost in the middle of this empire, uh, enjoyed a very important strategical position, which particularly became evident from around late 19th century to early 20th century. Um, in fact, if you look some of the advertisements related to the empire, during 1920s, 1930s, more in particular, you had commercial flights uh, trying to connect different parts of the empire. One major company was known as the Imperial Airways, and if you look at some of their ads, of course, commercial flights were still very expensive, and it was quicker in the sense of being quick, being regarded as quick during those times. Because if you look at one of those advertisements, they took pride in the fact that how you could now travel between London and India within 7 days. In terms of Australia and New Zealand, within 11 days. Uh, there would be frequent stoppages all through the empire with accommodation and everything, hospitality provided by the imperial company itself. Of course, hugely expensive. Only could be afforded by very high-ranking officials, etc. But even if you, why I'm saying this, even if you look at those destinations, etc., you had to stop over in India if you were traveling into Asia and Africa from Europe. So India was strategically important because of its geographical position. The second reason why India was important to the British Empire was, of course, because of its army. Uh, since 1857 till Indian independence in 1947, if you look at any major British imperial campaigns, Indian army has played a role. Uh, the Boxer Rebellion in China, Boer Rebellion in South Africa, First World War, Second World War, the Indian Army would always be there in multiple destinations, Asia, Africa, and even in Europe, which had its own implications, to which I'm not going to get into because it's a fascinating study of how an Indian soldier would analyze his or his position as a part of the imperial campaigns, etc., and coming up with curious results. Particularly fascinating because most of these soldiers were not traditionally Western educated, who essentially could theorize and all. But if you look at their letters written home, still kept in the archives, or those who those who have those more educated who have maintained some diary etc. It's a fascinating story. For instance, you have case of one Indian soldier fighting in the Boer fighting in the Boxer Rebellion in China, writing back home that we shouldn't be here fighting this. I have heard from my grandfather and from other elders stories of the Great Revolt of 1857. And it seems the Chinese here are fighting something like this, which I heard. 1857 must have been something like this. We should have helped them instead of helping the Sahibs, for whom we are fighting just for money. Fascinating. A common soldier uh, who has not read anything on nationalism, imperialism, etc. How did he derive this idea from being in a particular situation? Or if you come down to First World War, you have numerous uh, uh, records of Indian soldiers fighting in other parts of Europe. Before that, mostly the Sahibs they have seen were uh, British, but now, when they were fighting in other parts of Europe, like in Belgium and France, you have letters written home that not all Sahibs are racists. We find French, the Belgians are more accommodative. In fact, some of the French some of the French villagers would allow Indian soldiers to stay in their homes during when the war was being fought. Unthinkable. Uh, as he said, back in India or in London. As a result of it, so you have these sort of experiences, which particularly became important in the post 1920s, because as you know, post First World War, because of greater opportunities created in Europe because of a population decline, particularly how the youth got affected because of fighting in the First World War. Depression as well as opportunities generated less interests in colonies. So much so that some scholars have pointed out that uh, the British Empire faced a manpower crisis in the post 1920s period, as a result of which you had a corresponding indigenization. If you look at the long-standing demand of the Indian nationalists of introducing simultaneous civil service examinations in India, so that more and more Indians could appear for civil service examination. This was a late 19th century demand. This was finally accepted during, I've exactly forgotten the exact date, probably 1924 or 1923, when simultaneous civil service examinations began to be held also in India. Similarly, if you look at the records of Indian civil service, you have more and more Indians entering into the service, which had implications for foreign policy also, which I will come to just a little later. It also had tremendous impact in shaping up of the British Indian Army. Till now, Indians were mostly being recruited as soldiers, but 1920s onwards, you would increase if you check the records, you will find increasing number of Indians as officers within the army in various positions. So much so that by 1930s, the British Empire had to create a military training institute here at Dehradun called Indian Military Academy. It still exists to turn out more and more officers. You did not have to visit uh, Britain again to become an officer in the Indian Army. And as a result of which, compared to First World War, if you look at Indian reminiscences about Second World War, you find more texts, more diaries, more letters coming in from the officer class. Uh, that's a fascinating story in itself. Now, as a result of indigenization process and because of the colonial empire uh, and the Indian colonial state developed a strong Indian voice. The colonial state, of course, it differed from the nationalist position. The colonial state used to project India as essentially a strategic base. Uh, it was, you know, a, a military barrack in the Oriental Seas. The Indian Army, which is to be used to quell rebellions all across the British Empire and also to keep peace within the empire. Uh, but it also happened that because of the distance and because of an outlook being developed within the colonial state here, the voices coming out from British India did not always match the imperial voices coming out from London. And this distinction was becoming increasingly prominent as time passed by. As you know from your own readings of Indian history, uh, if you look at the colonial states administration system, you had a portfolio system being developed by Lord Mayo uh, back in 1865. The only Governor General of India who was unfortunate enough to get assassinated in India during a tour in Afghanistan. And subsequently, by late 19th, early 20th century, uh, slowly the portfolio system, one person in charge of certain fixed affairs were becoming prominent. Now, one such department which was increasingly becoming prominent uh, since late 19th century and early 20th century was FPO, the Foreign and Political Department within the Indian colonial state. Now, the Foreign and Political Department was a curious department in the sense, uh, what did they define as foreign? If you look at the operations of that department, the foreign department essentially would focus on India's neighborhood. And how did you define India's neighborhood? uh, in terms of appointments and envoys, and that included both Europeans as well as Indians. Uh, you see these appointments being made in various parts of Asia, Africa, particularly in East Africa, and later on, even abroad in West Asia, etc. And the political department's task was the political department's task was to maintain the relationship between the colonial state and the princely states. Remember, there were over 300 princely states here, some quite prominent. Now, gradually, the foreign and political department, the foreign aspects of political department began to be regarded as increasingly important, which cannot always be controlled from London. And this was happening within the colonial state itself. Now, if that was happening because of strategic, if this was happening both because there were numerous officials stationed in India who were of the opinion that you cannot really understand uh, the strategic implications or strategic happenings in Asia, Africa, sitting in London. You have to be stay. So uh, the Indian administration must be given some autonomy to deal with contingencies and also must be granted some degree of independence in terms of developing independent policy making. Now, not that always it was accepted by London. You had major tussles from time to time, uh, and but it was increasingly becoming clear. Just to give you some examples, Sir Alfred Lyle, I'm sure you have heard of his name, one of the major pioneering administrators. was writing back in 1896 in one of his official correspondence, uh, and this is about what should be his conceptualization of British India's foreign policy. And what is it? I'm quoting: the foreign relations of India are regulated by a kind of uncertain Monroe doctrine. I mean that we maintain over all the countries immediately adjacent the policy of allowing no intervention by other European nations, and the predominance of no influence except our own. It is this necessary attitude that drives us our incessant occupation abroad in Asia and brings us into continual contact or collision with European rivals. The defense of India during the 18th century had been sought to be assured through supremacy at sea, but these developments give rise to a new consciousness or the importance of the land frontiers. Uh, Alfred Lyle, 1896. And this, you will find this as a recurrent phenomenon within the interactions between British India and the government in London. Uh, I will quote another official, Lord Morley, of the famous Morley-Minto reforms. Uh, in 1907, if you look at one of his entry, I quote, "The plain truth is that this country, meaning India, cannot have two foreign policies." And somewhat more explicit, as it was his style, the famous or infamous Lord Curzon, 5th May 1904, his Governor General's dispatch to London. Uh, what are key strategic concerns of the British Indian state? And I mention, I quote, "Our foreign department is now called upon to know, to understand, and to advise upon the foreign affairs insofar as they affect either India or Great Britain, of the whole of the vast area which stretches from," note, "Yunnan on the east," Yunnan which is in southeast China, "on the east to Baghdad on the west, and from Tashkent on the north to Indian Ocean on the south." And if you look at the areas of concern today, it still remains major areas of concern for modern Indian policymakers. Now, these this was not only restricted to British policymakers. As I said, by 1920s, as you had more and more Indians entering into the service, etc., the British administration also began to develop a sort of, strong began to develop a sort of strong Indian opinion, which by 1920s, 1930s were no longer afraid to express their opinions, even if they ran counter to any official declaration, etc., which was happening in Britain. Uh, if I give you some more examples, uh, just a second. The yeah. Uh, For instance, if you look at, India was one colony which was allowed to send in its own official delegation to the Versailles Conference of 1917 following the ending of the First World War. Of course, it was none of there were no representatives from the Indian national parties like Congress or Muslim League. It consisted of a number of officials as well as some selected Indians. But nonetheless, India was one colony uh, from where a separate delegation was allowed to go, which showed you, not that Indians nationalists were satisfied with this, which resulted in something else, which I will come uh, to shortly. But if you look at the imperial position, uh, it was clear during the 1917, it was also ensured that India, British India, was to have its own representatives in the newly created global institution, which was the League of Nations. So, uh, there would be separate representatives coming in from Britain, and there would be separate representatives coming in from British India. And many of them happened to be Indians, and as I said, were not really afraid to voice their own opinions. I will give you just one example. This is from a member of an Indian delegation to the League of Nations in 1929. Uh, and I quote him, in 1929, the number of Indians employed in the Secretariat of the League and the position which they have so far occupied are conspicuously inferior, in our opinion, to the relative importance of India as a country, and to the place which India should rightly occupy among the state members of the League. Now, uh, if this was happening in terms of the colonial state's official position, what were the opinion and views of the Indian nationalists, Congress, and others regarding India's foreign policy? Now, why was it important? Because if you look at it, foreign policy, Indians abroad, was something which has always interested the Indian nationalists right since the beginning. If you look at the resolutions passed within the Indian National Congress since its since it was set up in 1885, there would always be one session which focused on imperial campaigns, the Burma campaigns, the Afghan campaigns, etc. And the other focus would of course also be on Indians. And remember, because colonial system, imperial British Empire created a sort of uh, modernization and linkage facilities for a large number of Indians settling all across the world. Of course, within British Empire, but also in other areas. And these areas were, in all these areas, all these Indian communities in large numbers, wherever they settled, they became concerns of British India. By 1930s, you could find large sections of Indian communities not only in Asia and Africa, but also in Europe, in North America. If you remember your Gadar movement, etc., you would know how significant those communities had begun. Uh, and in fact, by 1930s, the Indian Foreign Office was reporting about Indian activities in several important countries in South America also, like Brazil and in Argentina. So it gives you an indication the global spread of the Indian community, the so-called Indian diaspora, if you would like it, and all these were matters of concern before the Indian nationalists. So, if you look at the Congress resolutions regarding colonial policy making, there would be severe criticisms around there would be severe criticisms against, for instance, imperial uh, colonial states' military policies, military adventures in Afghanistan, in Burma, etc. And what was the main argument? Why are they against these military campaigns? Because Indian money, Indian men should not be used in foreign campaigns without Indian consent. They demanded more inclusion of Indians into the legislatures to approve these things. Now, if we go back to our original question about territoriality being one of the most important element of your foreign policy outlook, the Indian nationalists, very significantly, when they were defining Afghanistan, Burma as outside India, they were accepting the territorial map of India as given to them by the British. Because by and large, they were accepting the map of India, which was being given to them in 1857-58. You wouldn't. They were referring. Of course, there would be glorifications of in terms of historical heritage, etc. There would be somewhat glorification of Indian campaigns during pre-colonial times, Indian settlements, Indian cultural spread into Southeast Asia, other parts of Asia, and beyond. But these would be regarded as, uh, examples of benevolent imperialism rather than these areas belonging to India as such. So territorially speaking, was that important? It was important because, as I said, remember, a lot of Indians were settling abroad as a part of the British Empire. And it was many of these Indian communities would maintain links with the nationalists. In fact, in many areas, you would have local units of the Congress being set up, local journals and magazines supporting Indian independence movement being set up. You would have Indian nationalist leaders traveling to these areas from time to time. And one major question would be, what would be our status after independence? And significantly, there would be never a very clear answer. It was difficult to give a clear answer. The second problem was not, it's not always that Indian community was liked as foreigners. There were, of course, stories of uh, intermingling, settlement, acceptance of Indian culture, and all that. But there was also another story of riots against Indian community. By the way, uh, apart from Indians as a large settlement community within Southeast Asia, you also have the example of Chinese also, and there would be frequent anti-Chinese riots also in various parts of Malaysia. In post-independence period in Sri Lanka, for instance, you would have the Sinhalese attacking the Tamils, etc., because those attacks became a part, because became a part of their uh, nationalist outlook and development. They thought this was the settlement of Indians, etc., were all part of the colonial exploitation process, and it was time to get rid of that. Anyway, that's a different story. The point to remember here is, if you look at the nationalist interaction, so on the one hand, the nationalists tried to reject the colonial state's projection of India as a strategic space. That why is India important for British imperialism? Because India's army is a significantly large and powerful army which could be used in imperial campaigns globally, and of course India's strategic space. Now, the nationalists were criticizing that. The nationalist position was Indian influence is benevolent. India essentially is an ancient culture, and other Asian cultures have derived influence from India. In a sense, Indian approach, Indian influencing factor is benign. It does not essentially reflect on a strong militarism or conquests, etc. Now, that was part of the story. However, this idea that a part of pre-colonial India has to be glorified in contrast to colonial Indian policy making, however, created its own problems. Since we are talking about historical dimensions, it was not only restricted to nationalist leaders like Nehru or other members of the Congress as such, but it was something which was attracting considerable amount of intellectual attention from late 19th and early 20th century. A part of the Enlightenment process, if you would like to call it, a part of the Bhadralok outlook, uh, and this was increasingly getting reflected in the writings and the speeches of a large number of Indian scholars, etc. Binoy uh, during 1920s, for instance, you have the Greater India Society, which was created, which studied a lot on, focused lot on these ancient Indian linkages with the East, etc. And if I quote from some of those lines, some of their writings, Kalidas Nag, for instance, a well-known Indian scholar, of course, writing in Modern Reviewer, very much a founding member of the Greater India Movement and Greater India Society. Kalidas Nag, writing in Modern Review in an essay, which was essentially a review essay of his 1922 tour of Southeast Asia. What was he writing about uh, the Indian connection with Southeast Asia? We just quote from one section. What a magic in the name Singapore, 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 evoking the memories of millennia. How Indian sea wolves and sea lions have roared here while passing through this gate to the Eastern Ocean and have left permanently to this harbor the legacy of their names in the native dialect of India. Singapore is a symbol of that movement towards the sea and that hunger for the unknown that makes up the marvelous history of ancient Indian civilization. Uh, Another person. This also comes from a 1927 uh, journal article published by the Greater India Society. I quote again: the ancient Hindus of yore were not simply a spiritual people. India also had its Napoleons and Charlemagnes, its Bismarcks and Machiavellis. But the real charm of Indian history does not consist in these aspirants after universal power, but in its peaceful and benevolent imperialism, a unique thing in the history of mankind. Did it have, did such cultural outpourings have any direct links with Indian nationalist outlook? It had. I will just give you one or two examples. And you see how the official Indian nationalist position, however, they tried to separate themselves from the colonial outlook of projecting India as this great strategic space, etc. However, somehow, even in their outlook or in their positioning, they were coming close. They were falling into the trap of coming close to such an imperial outlook. Why? I will just give you one example. All of us know about Bal Gangadhar Tilak. As I said, India was one colony which was allowed to send its own team of representatives in the during the Versailles settlement, Versailles Congress, 1917. What happened was the Indian nationalists, as you know, because there were nobody selected from the Indian national parties, etc. Only Indians as officials were sent. Uh, the Indian Congress decided to send at least one member on its own initiative. Now, as it happened in 1917, Tilak was in London fighting a case. If you remember that his old case with Valentine Shirol, English official here, and it was being now fought in London court. Tilak, since he was already in Europe, Bal Gangadhar Tilak was asked to submit a representation on behalf of the Congress to, which would be different from that of the official Indian delegation's representation, to show that what actually Indians think. Now, Tilak visited, Tilak submitted two petitions. Tilak submitted, it both to Clemenceau as well as Woodrow Wilson, the American president, whom you know represented United States in the Versailles Congress. Now, Clemenceau did not even bother to reply. Woodrow Wilson did send Tilak an acknowledgement. Now, if you look at Tilak's, what was Tilak writing? If you look, I will just quote from one portion. Why is India important to Indians? I will quote from Tilak's representation. With her vast area, enormous resources, and prodigious population, she may well aspire to be a leading power in Asia, if not in the world. Not very, actually, very different from the representation of what the colonial states approach, or what some of the officials in British India were writing about India's importance. Now, so overall, you already see a coming together of Indian, knowledgeable Indians, as well as colonial states' approach towards Indian foreign policy. There were, of course, differences. It was not similar. Indians, for instance, opposed and supported nationalist movements everywhere going on in Asia, Africa, etc. Indians strongly opposed the imperial wars, etc. But on the other hand, that India is to be regarded as a natural leader of this world after decolonization, because of its vast history, because of its geographic position, because of its population, because of its ancient culture, was something which generally tended to influence Indian policy making to a large extent. Were there exceptions? Of course there were. As I said, because of increasing number of Indians coming in within the imperial setup already prior to independence in 1947, within foreign service, which increasingly was now getting separated. It had already the foreign and political department by 1930s. The Indian foreign office had already been created. 1946, the Indian foreign service would be officially started. A very conservative organization, by the way. If you look at some of the early generation members writing on Indian foreign service, J.N. Dikshit, for instance, who would later on become Indian Foreign Secretary, would mention that during 1950s, there was one provision, for instance, which was a continuation from colonial times, that every new entrant into the foreign service had to be at least 5'8" in height. Now, Jane Dikshit said that Nehru rejected, and he jokingly remarks that I am lucky that Nehru rejected this provision because, me being a South Indian was was of a very short height, so I could have never made it into the foreign service. If you look at early generation, there would be detailed instructions on, of course, horse riding, etc. There would also be detailed instructions on how to write back if there was an invitation for dinner from your superior. How should you write an acceptance letter thanking him? How should you dress up during officials' dinner, etc. It's not that there was no transformation. There was no, you know, nationalism would affect you in curious manner, even within the imperial system. There would be some who would be more closer, who would be very hostile to the Indian nationalists. There were some also within the service. You know, prior to 1920s, it would perhaps be unthinkable for a British government official to publicly maintain contacts with Indian nationalists. Beyond 1920s, 1930s, it was no longer so. There would also be a transformation in your outlook, etc. And sometimes these transformations would also be internal. Uh, in many ways. Just to give you one example, Shubhimal Datta, Shubhimal Dutt, as you would mention his name himself, was India's oldest serving foreign secretary. He had also joined service as an ICS during 1920s. He came from a remote area of eastern Bengal. Now, if you look, there has been his biography has been uh, published recently. If you look at his biography, he mentions that when he had joined ICS as an officer during his early days, he would always, in his early days, he would join foreign service later. Initially, he would serve in the districts as a district magistrate, etc. As a district magistrate, he would take care to always carry a plate, a spoon, and fork. Why? Because as a district magistrate, during his village tours, he would often be invited by local zamindars, and he would refuse to eat in a proper Bengali gentleman style. He said, as an ICS officer, I cannot be seen to be eating sitting cross-legged on the floor, eating with my hands. So even if I was eating in a zamindar's house, I would have my own folded table and I would use my spoon and fork, however comical it might look. This person was, you can, there was a change of his mentality when you look at, because this person would continue to serve till Nehru's time. He would retire during Nehru's time during 1950s, and he would be brought back as India's first ambassador. He would be brought back to retirement after Bangladesh became independent, and he would be appointed there by Indira Gandhi. By that time, if you look at his writings around 1950s, etc., he is not so westernized anymore. In fact, he's increasingly critical of Western attitudes, etc. He's becoming indigenized to a large extent in his approach. Part of that is due to his own personal issues, like, for instance, he lost his son while serving as India's ambassador in Soviet Union, which probably explains his hatred for the communists, etc. Because he claims that in Soviet hospitals, uh, the medication for his son, who was epileptic, was wrong. And during the later stages of his career, he was also becoming increasingly spiritual, becoming a devotee of Ananda Mohima, which gets reflected in his writings, etc. But still remains a conservative. For instance, he criticizes some of his juniors for hobnobbing with Awami League junior members, etc. He said, diplomat has to be diplomat. However friendly you might be with Awami League members, you cannot or you should not show that openly, which would antagonize the opposition leaders, which perhaps predicted what would happen in 1975, assassination of Mujibur Rahman and others. But that's a separate matter altogether. Now, as I said, if you look at the Indian approach, increasingly acceptable, the one significant, it's not that everyone dealt with ideology. Some of them reflected hardcore realism also. If Subhimal Dutt is one example, the other major example is a man named G.S. Vajpayee, Girija Shankar Vajpayee, who would go on, he was also an early generation ICS, who joined the service around 1920s. This person would, in Nehru's India, he would become the first Secretary General of the Indian Foreign Office, a hugely important position during those times. Now, Vajpayee, Girija Shankar Vajpayee, unlike Subimal Dutt, was not very friendly towards the nationalists, at least before 1947. Um, in fact, during the Second World War itself, he was considered important enough as to be posted as India's Secretary General in, not Secretary General, sorry, not India's Agent General in Washington, United States. So Girija Shankar Vajpayee was being appointed by British India as India's Agent General, who would maintain a separate link with British Indian government here. And if you look at his correspondence between 1945 till he was there till 1946, then he came back, and then after 1947 he would become India, the first Secretary General in independent India's Foreign Office. But Girija Shankar Vajpayee's writings are important because if you look at his notes sent to India between 45 to 46, one person who was looking at United States, which was to become the principal global power post Second World War period, and if you look at his attitude, uh, what is his remarks about United States? He remarks that a notoriously insular people. And he predicted that United States, just like as it had happened during First World War, they would withdraw back. They were not going to maintain a continuous link in Europe. He was wrong, of course, but around 1945, early 1945, there were many American senators, etc., whom he was meeting, who were of that view that and then Cold War happened. And then regarding India, future India's foreign policy, what would be his comments? His argument was that in global politics, he was a realist in the sense he was critical of Nehruvian or Indian nationalists' idea about greater Asianism, greater third world solidarity, etc. He was a realist in the sense that Girija Shankar Vajpayee was, if you look at his correspondence at least between 1945 to 47, he is writing that, in global politics, you have a weak country like India has to align itself, even if it becomes independent, it has to align with a major power in the world. Now, in 1945, he was witnessing, he mentioned that there are now three major powers in the world. One is, of course, the old Britain. The second is Soviet Union. The third is, of course, United States. And he says India has to choose between these three. Who would India choose? Look at look how he analyzes. He says, let's take Soviet Union. He knows that Nehru and many other Indian nationalists are sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Many of them believe in socialism. But he says that whatever I have learned here about Soviet Union is that Soviet Union, I quote him, prefers satellites rather than friends. Satellites rather than allies. Would independent India, particularly Indian nationalists who talk about the glory of India, India's ancient civilization, would love to become a satellite, would allow themselves to become a satellite of Soviet Union? He didn't think so. So Soviet Union, no question of allying with Soviet Union after independence. United States, as I said, his prediction was United States would not be that much interested in global affairs after the ending of the Second World War. He was wrong, of course, but in 1945, many other people thought so. Uh, so United States did not seem to be overtly interested in Asian solidarity, etc., particularly in India. So India was, so United States would also be out of question. That leaves the only power, uh, Britain. Now, Girija Shankar Vajpayee argues, India being a former colony of Britain, would India like to maintain a sort of very cordial relationship or alliance with Britain? And then he argues back that why not? Uh, in global politics, you cannot afford to be sentimental. So he strongly advocates India become a member of Commonwealth. Now that is Girija Shankar Vajpayee's position, and as you know, as I said, since in post-independent India he would become India's Secretary General, working directly under Nehru. A lot of shaping up of Indian foreign policy would and future directions of Indian foreign policy, at least for the next decade after 47, would take place under him. There were numerous personal. It's not that other opinions were not there, but I wouldn't be going into those details right now. Uh, to conclude, if you look at just from the eve of independence, 1946, as you know, how the nationalists were trying to, coordinate all these positions together. Uh, in 1946, March 1947, we became independent in August 1947, but in March 1947, you had primarily under Nehru's initiative, uh, an Asian Relations Conference which was organized in Delhi, which would be attended by numerous representatives from Asia, Africa, uh, numerous representatives from Asian Soviet republics, the Soviet republics which were in Asia. And in fact, if you look at British Foreign Office correspondence, they are extremely wary that how is it that within the Indian Council for World Affairs, which was essentially organizing this Asian Relations Conference, how come Britain and other powers were not being invited, whereas in terms of, because Nehru was inviting the Asian republics, inviting the Asian republics, Russia would be able to send in a lot of communist sympathizers, etc. You also had a side battle going on here about, which organization would ultimately achieve dominance or hegemony over foreign policy directions, etc. As I said, the Congress essentially supported and created the Indian Council for World Affairs, which basically came up organizing this Asian Relations Conference in 1947 March. There would be another Asian Relations Conference later on in 1949 also, but this was to be, the 47 conference was to be the first major one. Now, as it happened, this was not the first regional organization, first such international organization organizing, looking at foreign affairs. The London-based Chatham House, for instance, had sponsored setting up of an organization even earlier, back in 1943. It was called Indian Institute of International Affairs. But this was regarded by Indian nationalists as more officially sponsored, because you often had Governor General as its chairperson, or a large number of Indian officials as its chairperson. There were also a large number of Indian government nominated members, and slowly, within 1 or 2 years, it, it's not that it did not publish anything. It tried to publish a couple of articles, etc. But one problem of it was it did not meet regularly, and second problem was it was increasingly, because as the government became more and more wary of the Indian National Congress, the other institute, Association of International Affairs, Indian Institute of International Affairs, was being regarded as a Muslim League sponsored institute because a large number of Muslim League politicians were began to be appointed within this organization. In fact, when Asian Relations Conference would happen in 1947 March, there would be a lot of criticism from official side, government side, that this was a Congress show. It was not Indian Council World Affairs. It's not an independent organization of its own, but it was a regional organization. The other problem, other criticism would also be leveled by the Muslim League that, oh, it's a Hindu Brahmin dominated organization, which was not really and not should not be regarded as a proper independent neutral organization. Now, as it happened, Indian uh, Institute of International Affairs did not continue here for long. Post independence, it shifted its base to Pakistan, and there it was also winded up quite soon. But the main dilemmas of the Indian and the main directions of the Indian foreign policy making, and there I would conclude, was becoming increasingly clear during this conference itself. In the sense, if you look at the major concerns of India, Nehru's projection, etc., there was a somewhat acceptance of the fact. Everyone paid lip service to this question of Asian solidarity, Afro-Asian solidarity, uh, support from nationalist movements going anywhere in Asia, Africa, and all that. Imperialism and decolonization should happen. Second World War should not. So the early contours of neutral policy making. Remember, Nehru himself hated the term non-alignment. I mean, in numerous parliament speeches, whenever he heard about this non-alignment, he says that I have not devised anything like, and I do not like the term itself. We are definitely not non-aligned in terms of cultural linkages, economic linkages, or other linkages. By when I say non-aligned, I mean non-alignment in terms of major military initiatives, etc. Though how much of neutralism or non-alignment was actually uh, true, there have been some of the recent researches which have tried to focus on those aspects also. Um, because there are several new documents, etc., which reveals that some sort of attractive diplomacy or even secret diplomacy was always maintained by major powers, etc. In case of there were secret linkages with United States, both with United States and Great Britain, for arms supply, etc., during the Indo-China War, and of course, following the Indo-Soviet Treaty of 1970, 71, the entire aspect changes. But the essential focus on what came to be known in post-independent period as Nehruvian dimension of Indian foreign policy making, one could argue that there were historical dimensions which were influencing that sort of an outlook. And two, uh, to an extent, it was a combination of both the colonial states' outlook about India's strategic space defined. It was the only way it differed was it was not defined in sheerly military terms. It was defined primarily in terms of cultural hegemony, ancient cultural linkages, etc. But nonetheless, uh, it did project India, which was to be or which should be accepted as a natural leader of this sort of a partnership, etc. It, however, was the reality, however, was not so. There would be numerous problems both within our own subcontinent within South Asia because of various post-partition related differences with Pakistan and others. But even with other South Asian neighbors, we had our own problems. And then, as far as India's global outlook was concerned, it also generated problems because of because of India's economic status. Because a large India had to negotiate a lot to receive economic help, financial assistance, etc. So, on the one hand, there was an attempt to project in fact there was one scholar back in 1980s who mentioned India as this was a leftist scholar, Srikant Dutt, who in one of his thesis, which later was converted into a book, had mentioned that India was a proto-imperialist power in the sense that India would borrow from the West, but within the Afro-Asian setting, India would try to play exactly the same role by trying to provide assistance, financial assistance, other assistance, etc. But even then, it was not automatically often regarded as a leader. In competition with China, there was a big blow in the sense when China, after 1962 war, China was often accepted as a greater Asian power by numerous other countries. And because of Cold War dimensions, of course, there were other major divisions which prevented India's greater linkages with these areas, which were regarded as areas which with which India should naturally develop its ties because of the ancient historical linkages. Cold War dimensions would not allow you to do that. So post-independence period, there were difficulties. If you look at the major shaping up of Indian foreign policy making, and by and large, I would argue that this policy making would continue to determine this sort of policy making, which continue to be more or less stabilized till, I mean, of course, they were till around 1980s, and of course, 1990s. There would be one major break during 1980s when India clearly demonstrated its approach, that it could directly intervene within its neighborhood militarily if necessary. 71, of course, was another major problem, and post 1990s with the age of economic diplomacy and globalization, uh, a lot of Indian foreign policy outlook, etc., has changed. But the historical dimension still remains important because if you look at public speeches of every politician or every political leader, whichever party he or she might come from, uh, these attachments, these talks about ancient Indian linkages, non-alignment are never given up. Of course, there is an attempt now to give it a new dimension. Within foreign policy studies, you have a new concept called civilization states. In China, in particular, there have been a lot of studies in trying to project China as a civilization state. There has been a corresponding research in trying to focus on India, whether India could be projected as a civilization state. But civilization state is a multi-dimensional concept. I mean, of course, if a particular government tries to project a civilization state, it tries to focus on a particular ideology, it tries to focus on certain aspects. There might be other scholarly groups who might try to focus on other areas. But that's a matter perhaps of another lecture, another dimension. I've anyway taken enough of your time. Thanks for your patience. If you have any, oh, there are already some questions I would love to answer. I think there are already some questions. Just go through it.
Thank you, sir, for your excellent and valuable speech. And so many friends of myself and also my teammates told me that this is one of the finest lecture they have had till now. So if you give
Thank you.
permission, so we can go to the question answer section.
Sure, sure.
The first question is from Debojyoti Mondol. He says, how a good Indo-Pak relationship, if possible anytime,
Yes, Debojyoti, it's not that in India Pakistan problems you could analyze it from different angles. If you look at it in terms of connectivity, uh, before 1947, how do you measure connectivity? Uh, if you, in terms of economic partnership of connectivity, if you go back before 1947, because it was part of same administrative unit, you had a lot of linkages. What happened was, you know, Pakistan after independence, because it was so much concerned, and you know, I wouldn't go into the details about formation of Pakistan and all that. You have already read, you are aware of it. Uh, Pakistan's origin have been sought to be defined by various scholars. There was a time when this was regarded as a state created by Muslim intellectuals. Of course, the Mohajis would go and settle down there, but they themselves had problems with the Punjabi elite. If you look at the original capital was Sindh. Jinnah himself and others based themselves in Sindh, but they could it did not eliminate the fact that in the newly created Pakistan, the majority were, of course, the Bengali Muslims here in eastern India, but in western Pakistan, the Punjabis dominated, and slowly they began to dominate, all aspects of administration, be it military leadership, the range of other aspects of administration, etc. The second thing is that in case of India, Pakistan, you know, in if you look at common levels of inter, one problem with I think which hinders India Pakistan problem is in India, with all its faults, with its problems, you still have quite diversified population and middle class. In case of Pakistan, first of all, it's much more smaller than India, especially, what happened was any attempt towards diversification was lost when they lost uh, East Pakistan or Bangladesh. And this was done, and for this, you cannot, I mean, there are some recent attempts to once again to put Muhammad Ali Jinnah on a pedestal. Uh, Certainly he had his good points, but if you look at his the quality of his leadership after formation of Pakistan, he completely failed to look at the problems. For instance, during his first visit to Dhaka after Pakistan became independent, there was a huge demonstration because Bengali was not accorded status of an official language in Pakistan. Now, there was, he had to deliver a lecture before the students at University of Dhaka. This was after the creation of Pakistan, his first visit to Dhaka. There was huge students demonstration. When he rose to speak, the students shouted, "Official language for Bengali, official language for Bengali," and he refused to accept it, telling that Bengali is a Hindu language. It has too many Sanskrit words to be considered to be an official language in Pakistan. This was generation of problem there. There was a lot of exploitation. I don't know whether you've heard about the Pakistani economist Mehboob Haq, who later on became a major, an economist in the United Nations Development Program. Now, for a long time, till around 1950s, this person used to work for Pakistan 5-year program. And there, in a book written in 1950s, he was already pointing out how West Pakistan was economically exploiting Eastern Pakistan. And he was warning that this could not continue for long without repercussions. And we all know what happened during 1960s and early 1970s. So any chance of building up a diversified society in Pakistan was already lost when he had alienated uh, the Bengali Muslim intelligentsia in Dhaka, based in Dhaka. Second, uh, if you look at Western Pakistan today, uh, minority voices are often silenced. Even about 2-3 years back, there was an incident about members of the Hazara community being targeted. If you look at Sindh, often the Sindhis are targeted, so are the Baluchis, etc. So it's a sort of, it's quite natural that this sort of a parochial state has to project itself. The only way it could project itself as a strong state is a military state. So the importance of the army there controlling almost everything becomes important. The fact that Pakistan has an immensely strong strategic position has helped it in gaining a lot of help and aid from United States. Even today, with all problems, etc., if you look at United States campaigns in Afghanistan, if Pakistan blocks its access to Afghanistan via Pakistan, the only way they could reach Afghanistan either is to airdrop, which is hugely expensive, or to go, which again would be hugely expensive, and then you have to negotiate with Russia under Putin if you try to come through various other parts of Central Asia, etc. So if on the one hand you have that sort of a state, who do you negotiate with? There are opinion makers who would argue both the leadership should talk with each other. Civilians, as far as there have been a lot of attempts to develop track to diplomacy, people to people contact. We do have good friends there in some of our classes. Even last week, my friend from Islamabad University delivered a lecture on the status of Pakistani politics today. These things are okay, but at, whenever anybody coming to power in Pakistan has to satisfy the army still controls the shots there. So, in terms of Indian leadership, when you talk about negotiating with Pakistan, we all know the problem. So, no Pakistani leadership is in a position to guarantee that there wouldn't be any firing in the border. If the army wants, there would be firing. As long as the army thinks that they could engage India, this is a sort of, small scale warfare or non official warfare, if you would like to put it like that. Sub level warfare, which would continue to bleed India, they would continue with that sort of policy making. So, as far as Indian leadership is concerned, uh, who do you talk to? Either talk to the army, which is not possible officially, um, or continue to talk with the civilian leadership. But no civilian leader is in a position to guarantee you peace for a considerable period of time, because till today it's not that, and because of the civil society being weak, it's not that, because as it happened, as I said, the middle class base is very weak, the elite base is very weak. Till around 1990s, most of them who were dissatisfied with the local system within Pakistan had migrated abroad. Compared to India, it was much more easier for Pakistani elite to migrate abroad, particularly to United States. So if you will find a large number of Pakistani scholars, etc., today settled abroad. Uh, or as a result of which, and if you look at the lowest if you look at the lower strata of the society, madrasa education or education units run by some of those terror groups, organizations. And by the way, some of these terror groups are often do a lot of voluntary. They often run chains of NGOs and often reach the affected people during floods, during earthquake, during times of other contingencies. They often, uh, run their units in a much more efficient manner rather than the government organization. As a result of which, the local poor people, uh, often are very satisfied with their functioning, etc. And these groups also continue to function. So, you know, it's two different states with two different systems, uh, where it's easier for common people today to interact thanks to internet, thanks to other social media, etc. But for two states officially to interact with each other still remains difficult.
The next
Any more
question
questions?
is from Shovik Dasgupta.
Okay.
He has many questions. His first two question is, how was
Neighboring, please.
colonial India's relation vis-a-vis its neighboring princely states? Was it one-sided hegemony of the paramountcy? And was there any role of Indians in framing this bilateral relation? And second question is, how did the foreign relations impacted colonial hydropolitical polity, like sharing or Himalayan river waters, etc.?
Uh, well, it's not that I could perhaps I wouldn't be able to tell you much about this. These are not really my areas of research concerns. But you know, even as a student of history, if I could venture, princely states, it depended on not all princely states. It would always depend on by early 20th century, apart from occasional flare-ups, like for instance Ranigaidinlu back in 1930s, or there was this case of uh, Baroda, Gaikwad. It's a curious case. As there were some rumors that he was attempting to poison others. Uh, a link, some sort of control, etc., would have to be maintained over the princely states, etc., particularly in the neighborhood region. Uh, and particularly because this also would be strategically important, because remember, princely states like Patiala and in other princely states like Punjab, etc. When I talked about the Indian Army, not only the British official army contingents during First World War, during Second World War, a lot of princely states also had sent their own armed contingents to help in the imperial campaigns. So, and you know, as a geographical space and administration developed, you had to maintain into different, there would be different negotiations with the princely states. Just to, for example, as we know, from 1853 onwards, you had construction of the Indian Railways, Bombay to Thana, the first line. The second line would be from Calcutta to Raniganj. Now, later on, uh, the 5% guarantee system and all that, you had different uh, companies, unlike the railway system which we have today, which is still government controlled. So there are again talks about privatization in that sphere also. You had different companies operating in different areas. But Bombay Nagpur line, for instance, uh, or to go from Bengal to Bombay, you had to pass through different princely state areas. So, of course, you had to enter into some sort of an understanding, some sort of administrative mechanism with the different princely states, etc. So, all these things were there. As far as your hydropolitics, like sharing of Himalayan river waters, etc., uh, it was important. It was not consistent as a policy. Uh, of course, the study of geopolitics, as you know, would come up in early 20th century, and some of it certainly influenced important administrators here. And the young husband mission in Tibet, etc. Some of these were certainly influenced with concerns for Himalayan river water sharing and other objectives. In case of controlling of environmental resources, the way you look at the way you consider environment as an issue of formal geopolitics or foreign policy making was not so important during those times. Rivers would often be regarded as markers, dividing boundaries, etc. As borderline areas, of course, these would be important. Significantly, since you do not mention China in particular, but in some of the you know following independence, if you look at Chinese claim into some of these northeastern territories, etc., there is a strange similarity because some of these issues were originally raised when Kuomintang government organized. Kuomintang government had attended a conference with British Indian representatives looking at border demarcation covering some of these areas. And later on in 1949, when People's Republic of China happened, they were using the same texts. And they were using the same arguments which the Kuomintang government had then used. So it's not that uh, you know environmental issues, but these were still regarded in terms of strategic border issues rather than environmental issues as such. As far as uh, I know, I wouldn't be able to give you greater details on this because I do not really, this is not really my own area of research. But it's an interesting thing. If I find anything new, I would certainly report it back to you.
And his two more questions are in this connection, did colonial foreign policy patronize controlling of environmental resources vis-a-vis its neighboring relations? And how did colonial state catered with the Russian threat from north, particularly in Kashmir, Himalayan, and Central Asian region during the 19th and 20th century?
Well, on the environmental issues, as I mentioned, uh, just while answering the last question, that these were essentially regarded as border disputes. You had negotiations from time to time. As I said, the Kuomintang government, for instance, had negotiated with the British government over the border issues. The same arguments would be used again uh, after Indian independence in 1947 and after the People's Republic of China took over. But as so far as I understand, uh, these were not essentially projected as environmental problems. I mean, to what extent could you change the environment? Today, we are concerned with Himalayan rivers because you know uh, the Chinese government has the potential of using uh, atomic weapons to change the course of the river, and apparently they would do so in some of the high flowing rivers from the top, which might change the entire course of the river. Back in late 19th century or early 20th century, uh, no power in the world would possess enough military technology to change the course of entire river, etc. So essentially, when you look at disputes regarding environmental problems, or nor was global warming or uh, deforestation was certainly a problem, which was being highlighted there, highlighted by a large number of scholars. For instance, as a part of railway construction, a lot of Himalayan coniferous trees were destroyed to create railway track sleepers, to build up the railway track lines, etc. So this certainly encourage some of the officials to talk about over exploitation of natural resources and all that. But by and large, you know, environmental security is a matter of technological focus. As you become more aware and as you develop greater destructive power to affect the environment, uh, you are concerned with the river today. The river dispute previously river dispute today is a matter of large concern, because in case of China, if they set off an atomic device, a subterranean atomic device below the course of, let's say, Sangpo or Brahmaputra, it would change the entire course of the river, which is going to affect the lower riparian states like India and Bangladesh. Now, back in 19th or early 20th century, something like this would be unthinkable. So, of course, their concern with rivers, etc., would be a part of the larger question of border disputes, border demarcations, and all that. And not particularly with environment concerns as such. Environment was still, I would argue that environmental concerns were still not, had still not become a part of geopolitical or security studies as such. These were studied separately. But now, today, with modern knowledge, modern concern, and of course, our technological ability to destroy, uh, certainly these studies have also been securitized to a large extent. What was your second question? In colonial, there was a second question. The Russian threat. Of course, there would be, throughout 19th century, you must have read about the Great Game, our concerns with the border and how that necessitated when the power. I don't know whether you know the Russian prince. In fact, had visited a large number of Asian countries like Japan, and he had even visited India in late 19th century. The Russian prince, who would become later on the Tsar, uh, the last Tsar, and would fall from power in 1917. Late 19th century, when he was as a prince, he had visited several um Asian regions, including India. Mm, and he was of course welcomed, he was given official recognition, it was an official state visit, but there were of course a great deal of wariness as to where he was going, whom he was meeting, particularly among Indians, etc. You can find some of these concerns back even in writings of Indians, etc. If you have read Rabindranath's Chelevela, for instance, he writes in one chapter, he writes about there was this great rumor in Calcutta about the Russians coming in when his father was in Almora in Himalayas, and his mother insisted that young Robi write a letter to his father asking him to come down to Calcutta so that there is no danger if the Russians do come. And Devendranath, as Rabindranath writes, had written back to his small son that don't worry, if the Russians come, I have my stick ready. I will drive them away. So, and, you know, global politics was slowly, particularly because of the popularizing, as reading increased, as literacy levels increased, as public interactions over global issues increased thanks to more circulation of newspapers, etc. Uh, these things came under global attention. Uh, but till around 1940s, certainly it was being discussed. If you have read, you must have read Sumit Sarkar's Modern India. If you look at his chapter, in one of his chapter, he mentions that during Russo-Japanese War of 1905, uh, many Indians, when they read about, particularly Bengalis, when they read about successes of the Japanese against the Russians, many of them would name their young sons with Japanese names, names of famous Japanese generals they had read. তাদের ডাক নাম দেওয়া শুরু হলো জাপানি ইত্যাদিতে। সো একদম যে আলোচনা বা এই কনসার্ন নেই না, কিন্তু remember till around 1940s etc., the level was still very low. বিভূতিভূষণের রসনী সংকেত যদি পড়ে থাকো বা সত্যজিৎ রায়ের রসনী সংকেত সিনেমা দেখে থাকো, সেখানে একটা সিন আছে যে গ্রামের একজন জিজ্ঞেস করছে, আচ্ছা পণ্ডিত মশাই, এই যে যুদ্ধটা হচ্ছে সিঙ্গাপুর, এটা কি ওই মেদিনীপুর জেলার পাশে? And this was 1940s when literacy rate had increased. But the British, of course, were very much wary about the possible expansionist tendencies of the Russian Empire, uh, to an extent concerned with the Chinese also. But there was no doubt about the fact that, particularly after the opening up of the Suez Canal, etc., that in case of any problems there, they could easily rush in more armies and more soldiers. That's one of the reasons why they would build up the Indian army as a solid standing block against any such operations. The Indian army would be so strong as to not only protect India and subcontinent, but also serve British interests in rest of the empire also.
I think that's all. Thank you, sir, once again for giving your valuable time. And also thank you to our viewers who always support us and for whom we get inspiration to organize such lectures. Our next lecture is really an interesting session. It is on 23rd January 2021, and it is an interactive session with Dr. S.B. Ota, who is a former joint DG of Archaeological Survey of India. So keep your eyes on our Facebook pages for more updates and also for other forthcoming lectures of this work. And also who have missed this lecture on Facebook can look into our YouTube channel where we shall upload this lecture shortly. And also join us with our WhatsApp group, Telegram channel and Instagram page for further updates. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.